They called it the end. In the bitter winter of 1776, the American experiment stood on the very edge of total collapse as the dream of independence began to fade into the cold. The British Empire had driven the Continental Army out of New York. Cities had fallen one after another, and soldiers were deserting by the hundreds in despair. Enlistments were about to expire. Across the colonies, and even across the ocean, many had already decided that the rebellion was finished and hopeless. The United States of America, barely 6 months old, was about to die before it had truly begun, vanishing into the snow and silence of that dark winter. Yet in that darkest hour, one desperate and nearly impossible gamble would rewrite the fate of a young nation forever and change the course of history. It had started with hope. Only months earlier, the Declaration of Independence had been signed in Philadelphia by men who still believed in liberty. 13 colonies had dared to declare themselves free from the most powerful empire on earth, risking everything for the chance of self-government. Ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen had taken up arms, believing with quiet determination that liberty was worth any price they might pay. But belief alone could not stop the British war machine as it prepared to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force and professional soldiers. In the summer of 1776, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled in North America sailed into New York Harbor under bright and confident skies. More than 30,000 trained British soldiers and German auxiliaries landed on Long Island, ready to end the American rebellion quickly. Against them stood a poorly trained, poorly supplied American army of less than half that size, facing the greatest military power of the age. On the fields of Brooklyn, the Continental Army was nearly destroyed in a crushing defeat that left the cause of independence hanging by a thread. Only a miraculous nighttime evacuation across the East River under cover of fog saved Washington's forces from complete and final annihilation. New York City fell. Manhattan fell. The British flag soon flew over the largest city in the colonies, signaling what many believed was the end.
The rebels were driven westward, across New Jersey, in a long, humiliating retreat through mud, rain, and the growing shadow of defeat. The weather turned against them. Cold rain soaked the men day after day, and the roads became rivers of mud that slowed every step they took. Shoes disintegrated in the wet earth. Many marched barefoot through the cold, leaving dark and bloody footprints behind them in the snow. Disease spread rapidly through the ranks as morale collapsed, and the once hopeful army began to dissolve under the weight of constant hardship. By early December, the army that had once numbered 20,000 had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 effectives still willing to fight. Across the Delaware River, British commanders relaxed. General William Howe believed the rebellion was finished and ordered winter quarters. He ordered his troops into comfortable winter quarters, while Hessian mercenaries occupied the town of Trenton with little fear of attack. Loyalists throughout New Jersey openly celebrated, certain that the king's authority would soon be fully restored across the colonies. Even members of the Continental Congress fled Philadelphia in panic, packing their papers and preparing for what seemed inevitable defeat. George Washington faced a terrible truth. If the army dissolved at the end of the year, the cause of independence would die with it forever.
There would be no second chance. No foreign power would risk supporting a failed revolution that had already collapsed in the snow. The dream of a free republic would be remembered only as a brief and foolish experiment that ended in the cold of a single winter. In that moment of near despair, a plan took shape. It was reckless, nearly impossible, and yet it was the only hope the army still had left. On Christmas night in 1776, in a freezing storm of sleet and snow, the remnants of the Continental Army prepared to cross the ice-choked Delaware. The river was filled with dangerous floating ice. The weather was so severe that the crossing itself seemed almost suicidal to every man. The river was filled with dangerous floating ice. The weather was so severe that the crossing itself seemed almost suicidal to every man. Many of the boats were open ferry craft, barely suited for the crossing through the ice and the driving wind of that bitter night. Men stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark, their hands numb, their clothes soaked through, and their spirits hanging by the thinnest thread. Hour after hour they pushed across the river. Some boats were forced back by the ice, while others nearly capsized in the storm. Yet, slowly and impossibly, the army made it to the New Jersey shore, stepping onto the snow with exhausted but still determined feet. By 4 in the morning, more than 2,000 exhausted men stood in the snow on the far bank, waiting for the order to march. The planned night attack was already behind schedule. Dawn was approaching, and discovery by the enemy seemed almost inevitable. They marched 9 long miles through the storm toward Trenton, leaning into the wind as snow and sleet cut across their faces. The roads were nearly impassable. Men collapsed from cold and fatigue, yet the column kept moving forward through the blizzard. At the head of the column rode a tall figure in a dark cloak, his face hidden by the driving snow and the dim light of a single lantern. He spoke little. Every man who saw that silent figure understood exactly what was at stake for the future of their cause. At 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26th, the Americans struck the town of Trenton without warning. The Hessian garrison in Trenton was caught completely by surprise as Continental soldiers poured into the snowy streets. Many of the German soldiers were still recovering from Christmas celebrations when the attack began in the early morning light. Within less than an hour, the town was overrun. Nearly 1,000 enemy troops were captured in the sudden assault. The Americans suffered almost no losses in the fighting, a rare and precious victory after months of bitter defeat. Word of the victory spread like fire across the countryside. For the first time, the rebels had won a clear and decisive triumph. Enlistments that were about to expire were suddenly renewed. Men who had been ready to go home chose instead to stay and fight. New recruits began to appear at the camps. The psychological effect of the victory was enormous and immediate. The British realization that the rebellion was far from dead forced them to abandon their comfortable winter plans at once. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, outmaneuvering a larger British force and winning another sharp victory. The two battles, in the space of only 10 days, transformed the entire course of the war and the spirit of the army.
What had looked like certain collapse became the first true turning point of the American Revolution in that frozen winter. The road ahead would still be long and brutal. Valley Forge and many more hardships still waited in the years to come. More defeats still waited. Years of blood, sacrifice, and endurance still stood between the army and final victory. But the winter of 1776 had proven something the world had doubted. The United States would not die quietly. A nation that should have collapsed in the snow had instead found the will to fight on against impossible odds. And that single, desperate night on the Delaware River would echo through every American war that followed for generations. It would remind every generation that the darkest hour is not always the end of the story.